It was a chilly Thursday morning when Marcus made his way through the bustling streets of the city, his art portfolio tucked tightly under his arm. His heart raced with both excitement and nervous anticipation. After years of grinding, painting late into the night, and struggling to get noticed, today was supposed to be different. Today, he was about to meet Mr. Whitaker, a well-known gallery owner whose establishment was revered in the art community. His gallery had been the birthplace of many artists' careers, launching them into fame and wealth. Marcus believed that this could be the moment when his passion, his skill, and his vision would finally be recognized. He had chosen his best pieces for the meeting, 3 large canvases that displayed his unique perspective on the world, vibrant, evocative portraits of people who seemed to speak from the canvas itself, each painting telling a story of history, culture, and the human experience. Marcus wasn't one to simply follow trends. His work challenged the norms, blending modern aesthetics with deep cultural narratives. He'd put his soul into every brushstroke, hoping someone would finally see the depth of his creations. Upon entering Whitaker's gallery, Marcus was greeted with the pristine white walls, the clean lines of minimalism, and the subtle hum of classical music playing softly in the background. It was everything a traditional art gallery should be: quiet, polished, and elegant. The air smelled of fresh paint and polished wood, and the atmosphere felt almost sterile, like a temple dedicated to fine art. Mr. Whitaker was standing behind a large desk in the back of the room, talking to a client about a painting. His sharp suit and carefully combed hair gave him the air of someone who had made his fortune through his discerning eye and business savvy. He was, after all, a fixture in the art world, known for his bold, often controversial decisions in the art market. Marcus took a deep breath, holding on to his portfolio. This was his moment. He walked over to the desk, his shoes clicking softly against the marble floor. "Good morning, Mr. Whitaker," Marcus said, extending his hand with a polite smile. Mr. Whitaker glanced up, giving a brief nod. Yes, I know. You must be Marcus. We've been expecting you. Please, take a seat." Marcus sat across from him, adjusting his portfolio on his lap. "I brought some of my work to show you," he said, his voice steady but tinged with nerves. Whitaker raised an eyebrow. "Of course. But, just so we're clear, we're always looking for works with proven market value. Nothing too niche, you know?" He said this with a hint of superiority, as though he had just imparted some great wisdom. Marcus simply nodded, knowing full well that his work had value, something far beyond the fleeting fads of the art world. He opened the portfolio carefully and laid the first canvas on the table. The painting was a striking portrait of a woman, strong yet vulnerable, her gaze direct and piercing, evoking a sense of both pride and pain. The colors were bold, vibrant blues, deep reds, and rich yellows, capturing the complexity of emotion that Marcus felt had been missing from modern art. Mr. Whitaker barely looked at it before he dismissed it with a casual wave of his hand. Overhyped. It's just color on a canvas, you know? Doesn't really say anything new. It's all surface, no substance." He let out a short laugh, clearly uninterested. Marcus's heart sank, but he kept his composure. He knew that the art world was often resistant to change, and perhaps Whitaker was just one of those people. He wasn't going to let this one encounter define him. He gently moved on to the next piece, a vibrant abstract piece that mixed portraiture with geometric patterns, something he believed would appeal to more modern sensibilities. He placed it down in front of Whitaker, eyes searching for any sign of interest. Whitaker squinted at it, then let out a scoff. "It's, what, supposed to be art for the masses? Kind of gimmicky, don't you think? You're trying too hard to be relevant." He leaned back in his chair, clearly unimpressed. "This could never hold up next to the heavyweights we represent here." Marcus, his pride taking a blow with each passing moment, tried his best to remain calm. This wasn't the first time his work had been dismissed, but something about this moment stung more than usual. Perhaps it was the way Whitaker seemed so convinced that he knew exactly what art was supposed to be. Marcus knew his work was different, but that didn't mean it lacked substance. He moved on to the final piece, a large, striking self-portrait. It was intense, Marcus's face, full of determination and quiet strength, staring out from the canvas. His hands were painted with intricate patterns, a symbol of his heritage, and his eyes conveyed a sense of raw emotion that no other piece could capture. This painting was the culmination of everything Marcus had worked for, a piece of himself laid bare for the world to see. Marcus placed it on the table, hoping that, perhaps, this final piece would speak to Whitaker in a way the others had not. He had taken risks with this painting, opening himself up in ways he never had before. But Whitaker barely gave it a glance. "I'm not sure what I'm supposed to get from this. Too personal. Too individual. Art like this doesn't sell in the big leagues. I mean, look at it, who would buy it?" The words hit Marcus like a slap. He could feel his hands tightening into fists, his blood rushing to his ears. How could he not see it? How could he not understand that this was art? This was more than just something to be sold. This was a voice. This was history. This was culture. But Marcus held his tongue, though the words were screaming in his mind. He knew the value of his work wasn't something that could be easily understood by a man who viewed art solely as a business transaction. With a forced smile, Marcus slowly gathered his paintings, tucking them back into his portfolio. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Whitaker," Marcus said, his voice cool but carrying a weight of finality. Whitaker didn't even look up. "Yes, well, good luck with your, venture. But I think you'd do better to rethink your approach." Marcus nodded once, silently, before turning and walking toward the door. As he stepped outside, the cold air hit his face, but it was a welcome sensation compared to the stifling atmosphere of the gallery. He stood still for a moment, letting the wind wash over him, then made a decision. He wouldn't let Whitaker's dismissal define him. His art had a future beyond the limited scope of someone like Whitaker, who couldn't see the beauty and power in his work. With his portfolio in hand, Marcus walked away from the gallery, not with defeat in his step, but with a fire kindling inside him. He knew, deep down, that his journey was only just beginning. After the crushing encounter with Mr. Whitaker, Marcus found himself at a crossroads. For a brief time, doubt crept into his mind, whispering that maybe he wasn't cut out for the world of high art after all. Maybe his work wasn't as important as he thought, and perhaps he should have adhered to the mainstream expectations of what art should be. The sting of rejection was hard to ignore. Yet, as the days passed, that pain slowly turned into fuel. Marcus understood that he couldn't afford to back down. If anything, he had to prove Whitaker, and the entire art world, wrong. In the weeks following the gallery meeting, Marcus began to immerse himself in his work even more deeply. His studio became a sanctuary, where each brushstroke was a quiet rebellion against those who had dismissed him. He painted relentlessly, experimenting with new techniques, breaking boundaries he hadn't dared to approach before. He would wake at dawn, work through the day, and sometimes well into the night, forgetting to eat or sleep. His art became not just a form of expression, but a way to reclaim his voice. Marcus started to show his work at smaller, more intimate venues, local art shows, pop-up galleries, and community events. He didn't have the prestige or the connections that would have propelled him into the larger art world, but he had something more valuable: his authenticity. His paintings resonated with people in ways he hadn't expected. The vibrancy of his portraits, the raw emotion captured in his abstract work, and the cultural narratives embedded in every piece sparked conversations. People felt something when they saw his art. It wasn't just something to be admired from a distance. It was something that demanded to be felt. At first, the recognition came slowly. There were nights when Marcus would stand in the back of a crowded room, observing the reactions of the few people who stopped to linger at his booth. Most just glanced quickly at his paintings, moving on to the next display without a second thought. But there were always a handful of people who stood in front of his pieces for longer than expected, their eyes fixed on the colors, the textures, the stories unfolding before them. They'd ask questions, offer words of encouragement, or even buy a piece. With each sale, Marcus's confidence grew, and so did his reputation. One day, a prominent collector from the city's growing art scene, a woman named Elena Martinez, came across one of Marcus's works at a small art show in an old warehouse district. She was drawn to it almost immediately, the rich colors and striking contrast of his portrait leaving her speechless. Elena had seen thousands of paintings in her career, but there was something about Marcus's work that stood out. It wasn't just the way the art looked, it was the way it made her feel. She immediately approached Marcus, asking if he was available for a private viewing. Elena had connections with major galleries and collectors, and though she didn't speak to Marcus about his previous rejection by Whitaker, she could sense that his art was something special, something that could not only thrive but dominate the art world. She bought 2 of his pieces on the spot and insisted that he join her at a gallery event that evening. Elena introduced Marcus to a network of collectors, curators, and art enthusiasts. She spoke of his work with such enthusiasm that Marcus was humbled and overwhelmed. He was finally getting the kind of recognition he had dreamed of, not just from ordinary art lovers, but from the elite circles of the art world. As the months went on, Marcus's art began to gain traction with collectors and high-profile figures. His name circulated in whispers among the upper echelons of the art world. Elena had become his biggest supporter, and through her, he was introduced to more influential figures, galleries, auction houses, and even museums. His paintings were shown at curated exhibits alongside works from well-established artists, and though they were often dismissed by critics who still favored the old guard, the public was captivated. Marcus's work had a soul, a heartbeat that resonated with people in a way that was hard to define, but impossible to ignore. But it wasn't until an invitation came to participate in one of the most prestigious international art fairs that Marcus realized just how far he had come. The fair was held in Milan, a city known for its history in the world of fashion and art. The competition was fierce, with some of the most renowned artists from around the world showcasing their work. Marcus felt a familiar wave of doubt, but this time, he didn't let it drown him. He had earned this invitation. It was his time. When Marcus arrived at the fair, the sight of the other galleries and their luxurious displays was overwhelming. Massive, pristine white walls, perfectly lit exhibits, and sleek installations that screamed opulence and exclusivity surrounded him. In contrast, Marcus's exhibit was more modest, a reflection of his humble beginnings. Yet, there was something about the way his art was displayed that stood out. It wasn't flashy or high-tech, it simply allowed his paintings to speak for themselves. The moment the doors opened to the public, Marcus's booth was flooded with visitors. Art lovers, collectors, critics, and curators alike all gravitated toward his work. He could see the intrigue in their eyes, the curiosity that led them to pause and study his pieces more intently than they had with any of the other artists. Word began to spread quickly among the attendees, "There's a new artist here, and his work is something you can't ignore." By the second day of the fair, Marcus found himself in the midst of a bidding war. A renowned art collector from New York, known for his ruthless acquisitions, had set his sights on one of Marcus's paintings, a bold, expressive piece that captured the essence of resilience in the face of adversity. It was a self-portrait of sorts, blending surrealist elements with a fierce representation of Marcus's heritage. The collector, impressed by the unique blend of techniques and the raw emotion in the painting, made an initial offer that was far beyond anything Marcus had ever expected. But Elena, standing by his side, wasn't going to let the work go for less than it was worth. She knew its value, and she was adamant that Marcus deserved the best possible deal. The bidding war escalated quickly, with other collectors chiming in, all eager to secure a piece of Marcus's growing legacy. The price climbed higher and higher, far beyond the reach of what most of the artists at the fair could command. Marcus stood there, stunned. It was happening. The world he had once dreamed of, the world that had rejected him, was now fighting over his work. The final bid came in at a staggering price, a sum that would have been unimaginable to him just a year ago. The gavel came down, and the painting was sold for a price that made Marcus's head spin. As the fair concluded, Marcus realized just how much his journey had changed him. He had fought through rejection, struggled with self-doubt, and clawed his way into the spotlight. Now, his paintings were worth more than anyone could have predicted. But the real reward wasn't just the money, it was the recognition, the validation that his voice, his art, had not only found its place but was being celebrated on a global scale. Elena, proud of how far Marcus had come, congratulated him with a knowing smile. "This is just the beginning, Marcus. The world will never forget your name." And Marcus, finally at peace with his journey, knew she was right. The art world had underestimated him, and now they would see exactly what he was capable of. The road ahead was just beginning, and Marcus was ready to take it on. Mr. Whitaker had long been known for his sharp eye and exclusive taste in art. He prided himself on discovering the next big thing before anyone else. His gallery was a name to be reckoned with in the art world, always on the cutting edge, always in the spotlight. But the years of curating for the wealthy elite and managing a stream of profitable, high-value exhibitions had dulled something in Whitaker. He had become more concerned with profit margins and less about the true essence of art. To him, art was no longer about passion or revolution, it was a commodity, and like any commodity, its value had to be calculable. Despite his success, Whitaker's art world remained narrow. He relied on established names, those whose work was proven to sell at auction, those whose reputations preceded them. He didn't have the time or patience for artists who challenged the system, who defied trends, or who had the audacity to paint something so raw, so personal, it couldn't be quantified in simple monetary terms. That was Marcus, an artist who didn't fit the mold Whitaker had worked so hard to perfect. The months following their brief meeting faded into distant memory for Whitaker. He continued to boast about his gallery's success, consistently booking high-end exhibitions, catering to the whims of millionaires and art investors who wanted something recognizable, something familiar. Marcus's name, a fleeting presence in the back of Whitaker's mind, soon disappeared altogether. But everything changed on a quiet afternoon in late spring, when Whitaker, as usual, was preparing for a high-profile auction event in his gallery. He had just finished his final meeting with an international collector who had purchased several high-ticket paintings, when one of the assistants handed him the latest auction catalog. Whitaker glanced through it casually, but then one name stopped him cold: Marcus. It was a single painting, a bold portrait of a woman, her eyes fierce with determination, her hands adorned with intricate patterns. It was unmistakable. It was his work. Marcus had made it to the auction. In the past, Whitaker would have scoffed at the thought of Marcus's art entering such a prestigious venue. After all, he had dismissed it outright months ago. Now, though, the realization struck him like a lightning bolt: he had underestimated Marcus. He hadn't even considered the possibility that his former rejection might have pushed Marcus into the orbit of high-stakes collectors. Whitaker's mind raced as he flipped through the catalog, searching for details. The piece was set to be sold at an upcoming auction in London, with an initial estimate already in the six figures, a staggering figure for a young, relatively unknown artist. Whitaker was stunned. 6 figures. For Marcus's work. It was beyond anything he could have imagined. How had this happened? How had Marcus's art escalated so quickly? Whitaker's grip on the catalog tightened, his pulse quickening. He could feel the humiliation creeping in. He had dismissed the very artist who was now the talk of the town, the one everyone was clamoring to own a piece of. The day of the auction arrived, and Whitaker, still reeling from the shock of Marcus's meteoric rise, found himself glued to the live stream of the event, unable to tear his eyes away. He watched as the bidding started at an astronomical figure, higher than he'd ever seen for a piece from an artist so new to the scene. The numbers climbed with dizzying speed, whispers of Marcus's name echoed through the crowd of bidders, each eager to secure a work that had gone from relatively obscure to highly coveted in mere months. Whitaker watched as the price soared beyond the initial estimates, then far past his expectations. At one point, the bidding hit double the initial price, and it was still climbing. As the auctioneer's voice rang out, calling the final bids, Whitaker's heart sank. The painting sold for over 5 times its original estimate, a record-breaking price for a newcomer. The winning bidder was none other than Elena Martinez, the same collector who had supported Marcus early on. She had snatched the piece away from the crowd of eager buyers, securing it for a sum that would forever change Marcus's life. For a long moment, Whitaker sat frozen, his mind whirling in disbelief. How had he let this happen? How had he failed to see the potential in Marcus's work? He had laughed it off, called it overhyped and surface level. He had allowed his own biases to cloud his judgment, thinking that an artist who didn't fit the traditional mold had no place in his gallery. And now, here he was, watching as Marcus's work was sold for an obscene amount of money, to a collector he knew all too well. Whitaker could hear the echoes of his own words in his head, each one now sounding absurd. His phone buzzed, snapping him from his trance. It was a message from his assistant. There's a young artist at the fair who is making waves. Word is, his paintings are being sold for astronomical prices at auctions. You may want to take a closer look. Whitaker didn't need to read the rest of the message. He knew exactly who the artist was. It was Marcus, the very artist he had dismissed and belittled just months before. The message stung, a sharp reminder of his failure to see what was right in front of him. But it also lit a fire in him, a fire that he hadn't felt in years. Marcus had done something Whitaker hadn't considered possible. He had transcended the boundaries of the art world that Whitaker thought he controlled. The value of Marcus's work was undeniable now, and Whitaker realized that he had missed the boat. Shame flooded Whitaker's chest, but he couldn't afford to let it consume him. He needed to act fast. This wasn't just about personal pride anymore. This was about business. Marcus's art was now a goldmine, and Whitaker had let it slip through his fingers. If he could just get Marcus back, if he could somehow find a way to reconnect with him, maybe, just maybe, he could negotiate to buy the rights to his work before it went even further into the stratosphere. Whitaker immediately called his contacts, starting with the auction house where Marcus's piece had sold. He needed to find out who the new owners were, who had the pieces he had passed on. The thought of approaching Marcus directly felt like swallowing glass, but it was his only option. He knew that his reputation as a gallery owner was on the line. If he didn't act quickly, other buyers, other galleries, would swoop in, and Marcus would be lost to him forever. The problem was, Whitaker wasn't sure how to approach him. After all, Marcus had been insulted and rejected by him. The idea of him coming to Marcus with an offer now, after all the scorn he had heaped upon him, seemed ludicrous. But he couldn't afford to be proud. He would have to humble himself, swallow his arrogance, and beg for a chance to work with the very artist he had once mocked. Days passed in a blur of frantic calls, emails, and meetings. Whitaker worked tirelessly to track down Marcus's whereabouts, but it was clear that the young artist had grown increasingly elusive. He had learned to navigate the art world on his own, carving out a space for himself that had nothing to do with Whitaker's connections or influence. Finally, after weeks of frustration, Whitaker's assistant informed him that Marcus would be showing his work at another art event, this time in Paris. It was the opportunity Whitaker had been waiting for. He knew that if he could just speak to Marcus, get a chance to apologize, explain himself, and offer a partnership, he might still have a shot at bringing Marcus into his fold. But as Whitaker sat back in his office chair, staring out the window, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had already lost. Marcus had become a force of his own, something more than a commodity to be bought and sold. The question was no longer whether he could secure Marcus's work for his gallery, but whether Marcus would even entertain the idea of working with someone who had dismissed him so thoroughly. The realization stung. Whitaker had watched as Marcus had transformed from a dismissed artist to a global sensation, and now it was too late for him to do anything but try and salvage his pride. The art world was no longer under his control, he was no longer the one with the power. It was Marcus now. And Marcus had all the leverage. Mr. Whitaker was no stranger to pride. His gallery had long been one of the most respected in the art world, a beacon of success built on his keen eye for talent and his unwavering belief that he could shape the landscape of art. Yet, in the past months, his world had tilted off its axis. Marcus had not only defied his expectations but had also built a career that Whitaker couldn't have predicted, one that had turned the tables on him in a way he never could have anticipated. The young artist who had once been dismissed as overhyped was now the talk of the global art scene, his work commanding astronomical prices at auctions, and his name on the lips of every important collector. Whitaker's initial arrogance had cost him dearly, and now, desperate to reclaim what he had lost, he needed to find a way back into Marcus's world. Whitaker spent days preparing for the meeting, consulting with his colleagues, studying Marcus's rise, and analyzing every piece of art the young artist had sold. He knew the price Marcus commanded now, knew the respect he had earned, and knew that his previous offer of exposure and a gallery show had been nothing but a foolish misstep. Marcus was no longer the artist he had dismissed, he was a force to be reckoned with, and Whitaker needed to acknowledge that. The idea of approaching Marcus was not an easy one. His pride had always been a shield, something that had protected him when he was making tough decisions or handling difficult clients. But this was different. Marcus had outgrown Whitaker, and no amount of bravado could change that. He had to humble himself, acknowledge his mistakes, and offer something substantial. This time, it wasn't about his gallery's prestige or his reputation, it was about making an offer that would appeal to Marcus's growth as an artist, his understanding of his own value, and his ability to see what his work was truly worth. The phone call was brief but efficient. Whitaker's voice was steady, perhaps even a little too calm, as he asked if Marcus would be willing to meet at his gallery for a private conversation. Marcus, who had already become a name in his own right, had long stopped attending traditional gallery events. But there was something about Whitaker's tone, the simplicity of the request, that intrigued him. He agreed to meet at noon the next day. When Marcus arrived at the gallery, the space felt different. The cold, sterile environment that once had been filled with overpriced art and pretentious exhibitions was now quieter, almost reverent. Whitaker stood near the entrance, nervously adjusting his suit, his hands slightly trembling. Marcus entered, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. There was an unspoken tension between them, Whitaker standing as the former gatekeeper of the art world, and Marcus now the one with the power to choose how he wanted to move forward. "Marcus," Whitaker said, his voice softer than usual, "I must admit, I was wrong. About you, about your work, about everything. Your rise in the art world has been extraordinary, and he hesitated for a moment, knowing the weight of his next words, "I've watched it happen from a distance. I underestimated you." Marcus nodded slowly but didn't speak. He had heard the apology before, often in the form of hollow compliments from collectors who had once dismissed his work. But there was something about the way Whitaker spoke this time. It wasn't the usual polished, calculated art dealer facade. There was an undertone of vulnerability in his voice, something Marcus didn't expect. He was curious, but he wasn't ready to be convinced just yet. "I was hoping we could discuss a collaboration, Marcus," Whitaker continued, walking toward a corner of the gallery where his most prized pieces were displayed. "I want to offer you an opportunity to showcase your art here, at a premium. I'm willing to pay what your work is truly worth. I'm not asking for the typical commission or percentage. I'll take a back seat. This will be about you. About your vision. The way it was always meant to be." Marcus glanced around the gallery, taking in the polished floors, the walls lined with pieces he once thought were the epitome of success. There was no denying that Whitaker's gallery had a certain allure. But now, Marcus could see through it. He wasn't dazzled by the facade anymore. He had grown beyond the need for approval or recognition from those who didn't understand his work. What he had learned in the past year was that his art was not just for sale, it was a part of him, an expression of his soul that had a value far greater than any price tag could ever reflect. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Whitaker," Marcus replied, his voice calm but with a subtle edge that Whitaker hadn't expected. "But let's be clear, I'm not here because I need your approval or validation. I'm here because you've seen my value now, not because I'm the artist you think you can control." Whitaker swallowed, trying to keep his composure. This wasn't going as he had imagined. He had thought he would be offering Marcus a lifeline, a chance to step into the spotlight in the way only his gallery could provide. But Marcus wasn't seeking a lifeline. He was beyond the need for such things. "You're right," Whitaker said after a pause. You've earned everything you have. And I'm willing to pay for that. But I'm also willing to offer you a partnership, something we can both benefit from. Marcus studied Whitaker for a long moment, his gaze sharp. He could sense the desperation beneath the polished surface, the pressure Whitaker was under to salvage his reputation. It was a familiar feeling, one that Marcus had once known intimately. The need to prove oneself when all seemed lost. But Marcus was no longer in that position. He didn't need Whitaker's gallery to succeed. He was already succeeding on his own terms, his art now celebrated in ways that made him the one with the power. I've thought about this, Marcus said finally, his voice steady. I'm willing to work with you. But the terms have changed. I don't need your gallery for exposure. But what I need is to maintain control over my work. I want full rights to all my pieces. No restrictions. No conditions. Whitaker's eyes widened. This wasn't what he had expected. He had anticipated negotiating terms that would give him a significant stake in Marcus's future success. But Marcus was asking for something else entirely. Full control. The power dynamic had shifted completely. And, Marcus continued, I want a percentage of each sale that goes beyond the gallery's normal commission, 10%. I think that's fair, considering how much you underestimated me. If you're willing to accept that, then we can talk about a collaboration. Whitaker's mind raced. He had never been in a position like this. The gallery had always been the one to dictate the terms, to decide what was worth showcasing and what wasn't. Now, Marcus was in control. He wasn't just asking for a favor, he was setting the terms of the deal, demanding respect, and acknowledging his value. Whitaker opened his mouth to protest, but then closed it again. He could feel the weight of the moment settling in. He had no choice but to accept. Marcus was right, he had built something that was worth far more than he had ever anticipated, and Whitaker was just another part of that larger, shifting world. To deny him now would be foolish. I accept, Whitaker said, his voice quieter than before. He wasn't thrilled, but he was resigned to the fact that Marcus had already won. I'll have the paperwork ready. You'll have full rights, and the percentage will be yours. I won't interfere with your creative process. This is your show. Marcus nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. The tables had turned. For the first time, he was no longer the artist pleading for recognition. He was the one who held the keys to the kingdom, the one who controlled his own future. And in that moment, Marcus realized just how far he had come, not just as an artist, but as someone who had learned the true value of his work and, more importantly, his own worth. With a firm handshake, the deal was made. Whitaker had gotten what he wanted, but Marcus had gotten something even more important, his independence. He wasn't just showcasing his work in a prestigious gallery. He was choosing to collaborate on his own terms. The power dynamic had shifted completely. And Marcus, with his art now worth millions, knew this was only the beginning.